Okay, so let's go to combining functions multiplication. So the domain rule is the same. If you have a product, F, that dot means times. So that's a colored in circle, and that means multiplication. Later, you're going to have a different open circle, and that's going to mean a different thing. So this means f times g of x. That means you're going to multiply f of x times g of x. And the domain is the same. You're going to find the domain of f, you're going to find the domain of g, and then you're going to use the intersection. So you may have to do a number line. Okay, so same examples. The line f of x equals negative 1/4 x plus 1 and g of x equals 1/2 x minus 1. We want to find the domain. Well, the domain of a line is all real numbers. And all real numbers, so this domain is the intersection, which is all real numbers. Okay, so this says find f times g. Now there's nothing there. So you have to know that that means find f times g of x, which means you're going to take this function f of x and you're going to multiply it to that function g of x. So the algebra gets a little harder here. Okay, so parentheses negative 1/4 x plus 1 is f of x. Parentheses 1/2 x minus 1 is g of x. And you have to have the parentheses here because you need to know what to do when you see this. So this is called a binomial. There's two terms times, this is another binomial, two terms. So you have to FOIL, you may remember FOIL, F-O-I-L. Really, it's just distributing twice. I call it double distribute. So you got to take this negative 1/4 x and you have to multiply it to both of these. And you're going to create terms. All right, you can use the calculator to do the arithmetic and then you write down the terms. So negative 1/4 times positive 1/2. I'll get the calculator to do the numbers. That gives me, get the squiggle, and I get negative 1/8. Okay, so negative 1/4 x times 1/2 x is negative 1/8. And then you have to know the algebra rules. When you're multiplying x to the 1 times x to the 1, that gives you x to the 2. You add the exponents. So that's your first term. Then I have to distribute negative 1/4 x to the negative 1. And that's going to be a negative times a negative is a positive, and anything times 1 is just itself. So that's my second term. Now I have to distribute this 1 to both these terms. So 1 times 1/2 x is positive 1/2 x. And these are creating terms, and I'm putting addition and subtraction in between the terms. All right, now I have to distribute the 1 to the negative 1. And that gives me 1 times negative 1 is a negative 1, but when I write it down, it becomes a minus 1. That minus 1, if it's in between two terms, is a minus. If it's just by itself, it's a negative. All right, then I have to add like terms. So x squared doesn't have a like term, so I just write that down, negative 1/8 x squared. All right, and then these are like terms. They both have an x term, so I'll use the calculator to do the arithmetic. 1/4 plus 1/2 is 3/4. So that ends up being 3/4 x and then minus 1. And that's the new function that got created. So that's interesting. When you multiply a line times a line, you get a parabola. This is the new function. This is f times g of x. All right, so next example, we have two lines that happen to be parallel. All right, and then find the domain. Well, this line is all real numbers. That line is all real numbers. That means you can put anything you want in for x, so the intersection is all real numbers. So that's the domain. And again, we're trying to find f times g. So you may want to pause the video and try it yourself. There's nothing new going on, so you can try 7 and 8. Now come back with me. Hit pause. Okay, so f times g means f of x times g of x, because I didn't give you a number. So that means x plus 1, parentheses, times x minus 3, in parentheses. So that means I have a binomial, and I have to double distribute. X times x is x squared, and x times a negative 3 is a negative 3x term. 1 times x is positive 1x. See how I put the plus in there? I have to separate these terms out. And then 1 times a negative 3 is a negative 3. And then add like terms, and I get x squared minus 2x minus 3. So that's f times g of x, just a new function. Number 8, I'm given a parabola and a line, and I want to find the domain. So the domain of f, that's a parabola. You can put anything you want in for x, any negative number, any positive number, square roots. There's no restriction. Same thing for g. So this domain, again, is all real numbers. F times g means take this f function and multiply it to the g function. Use parentheses because now we have binomials and we have to double distribute or FOIL. FOIL means first, outer, inner, and last. So x squared times x, and your rules are you add the exponents when you're multiplying powers together. X squared times x to the 1 is x to the 3rd. And then x squared times a negative 4 is negative 4x squared. So we did the first terms and the outer terms. Now I'm going to distribute this 1. So that's 1x and negative 4. And then I'm going to look for like terms, and there aren't any. This is x cubed, that's x squared, that's x, and that doesn't have an x. So this is it. All right, last page. Find the domain of f times g using interval notation. Same thing. This is all real numbers. That's all real numbers. So that's all real numbers. Pause the video and see if you can find f times g of x. So that means f of x, some unknown number times, is what x is. F of x times g of x means x squared minus 1 times negative x squared plus 4. And I have to FOIL again or double distribute. So x squared times negative x squared. Okay, so the numbers are 1 and negative 1. So 1 times negative 1 is negative 1. And then you have x squared times x squared. You add the exponents. That's x to the 4th. And then 1x squared times 4 is 4x squared. Now I'm going to distribute the negative 1. Negative 1 times negative 1x squared is positive 1x squared. And negative 1 times positive 4 is negative 4. And I might stop and check my negatives. Positive times a negative is a negative. Positive times a positive is a positive. Negative times a negative is a positive. Negative times a positive is a negative. Okay, so now I'm going to add like terms, and this time there are like terms. So negative 1 x to the 4th plus 5x squared. Don't add the exponents when you're adding, just add the coefficients. So there is our function. All right, the last one, it says you try. So pause the video and try it out. Even if it looks hard, give it a try and then come back. So A says write the domain of f plus g, f minus g, and f times g. So all three of these are going to have the same domain. So you only have to do this problem once. The domain of f plus g, f minus g, and f times g is the same. You find the domain of f, you find the domain of g, and then you take the intersection. So I saved the hardest domain one for the last one. Okay, so the domain of f, we'll take it slow. You look at this f function, and there is a restriction when there is a square root, right? So you have to know how to do that. You have to say, oh, I know what's under the radical, 3 minus x, has to be greater than or equal to 0. And that's 3 minus 1x if you think about it. So this 3 is positive, not negative. It's positive. So you're going to subtract 3, and that is going to be minus 1x is greater than or equal to negative 3. Then you need to divide by negative 1, and you need to remember when you divide by a negative number, that inequality changes direction. And some of you may not be writing all of this down. When you have an inequality, you have to make sure you write your left-hand side and the inequality and the right-hand side so that if this switch happens, you don't get confused. All right, so the domain of f is all the numbers that are less than or equal to 3. So in interval notation, it would be negative infinity to 3 with a bracket. And I'll graph that in just a second. Then you have to find the domain of G, and this gets really tricky. So the domain of G has a restriction. You can't have a 0 in the bottom of a fraction, remember that? So the domain of G, you have to say, okay, x squared minus 25 cannot equal 0. And depending on where we are in the class, we probably haven't done very many of these. So I'm going to remind you how to solve a quadratic that is set equal to or not equal to 0. What you want to do is factor, if you can. And x squared minus 25 is pretty easy to factor if you remember it's called a difference of two squares. If you have a number squared minus another number squared, it's going to factor into a plus b, a minus b, which means the square root of that and the square root of that. So x squared minus 25 factors into x plus 5 times x minus 5. Okay, check that, because 5 times a negative 5 will give you a negative 25. So then after you factor, then you set each of these factors not equal to 0. So we find out that x plus 5 cannot equal 0, or x minus 5 cannot equal 0. So if we solve this one, x cannot equal negative 5. And if we solve this one, x cannot equal 5. So in interval notation, that's going to be negative infinity to negative 5 union negative 5 to 5 union 5 to infinity. So I'll show you why that is, because now we finally have, we've been patient, but now we have a hard domain one. So remember, the domain is of the sum, difference, and multiplication of two functions is the domain of f, and the domain of G, and the intersection between the two. So that's where this number line deal comes in. So I'm going to do two number lines, actually a third one, taking my time here. So the domain of f and the domain of G and the domain of f intersect G. Well, let's just do f intersect G. Okay. So, x is less than or equal to 3 looks like this. I'm going to put these key numbers in. See the key numbers? I'm going to graph everything, so I want it to be even. So I'm going to go ahead and have a negative 5 and a 3 and a 5. Okay. So the x is less than or equal to 3 would be a colored in circle and to the left. All the numbers less than or equal to 3 is the domain of f. Okay? And the domain of G is everything but negative 5 and 5. So when I do these, I think it's easier to do the not equal to open holes on negative 5 and 5 and then just color in everywhere else. And that's, if you got confused on how I got this interval notation, now you can see there's three pieces, negative infinity and negative 5. Negative 5 to 5, 5 to infinity. Okay, so now we need to do the intersection. So that means wherever there's overlap. So this is the hardest one you could probably have. It's confusing. So you're only going to color in where both of these are solutions are colored in. So you can see right here, negative 5 isn't colored in on the second graph. So that's not in the intersection. And then after you get to 3, this one stops being colored in, right? So it's going to have to stop at 3. And so everything else is in my domain. So then after you get the graph, then you want to put it in interval notation. So the domain of f plus g, f minus g, and f times g is the same. And it is, this piece goes from negative infinity to negative 5. Union, this piece goes from negative 5 to 3. Parentheses here because you're not including the negative 5, but a bracket here because you are including a 3. So it takes some time, but that's how you find the intersection of a sum, a difference, and a product. All right. Now it says compute f plus g and f minus g. So there's no number given, so we're just creating new functions. So f plus g of x is f of x, which is the square root of 3 minus x, plus g of x, which is 1 over x squared minus 25. And people make this so hard, but you're done. There's nothing to do. You can't add those two together. So we just leave it that way. And I have had so many people, I don't know, addition, you can't cross cancel, you can't multiply, you're adding, and you can't add these because they're not alike. So you're done. So C is going to be the second part is going to be very similar. F minus g of x is simply square root of 3 minus x minus 1 over x squared minus 25. So you're done. There are no like terms. There's nothing you can do. Now, C, f times g, there is something you can do, but it's not much. F times g of x means the square root of 3 minus x times 1 over x squared minus 25. And you can multiply fractions together. So if you put a 1 over that, you can combine that and say that your final answer is square root of 3 minus x times 1 is square root of 3 minus x over 1 times x squared minus 25. And you can make that into one fraction. But those you couldn't. All right, that's it.